So my first LCA was 2006, and it was immediately after I finished my research degree, and it got me my first job, and LCA has shaped my career throughout my entire career. I've now been to 12 LCAs, and I am a junior compared to these three. So without any further ado, I'll give you Stephen, Angus, and Hugh.
Hi. So we are three people who have been very lucky and fortunate to have been at every single Linux conference we've held in Australia, from CALU in '99 until we're here now. I'm Stephen. I was involved with lead organising in the 2005 team in Canberra, and I love this conference. It's just good fun, it's exciting, it's interesting, and we learn lots of stuff.
I'm Angus. I was one of the organisers of the 2001 LCA, and I've renegotiated at least one employment contract to continue to be at every single LCA.
And I'm Hugh Blemings. I haven't actually organised an LCA directly, but have been involved in Linux Australia, and like my two colleagues here, have been fortunate enough to have been at all the conferences over the years, and it's been quite a joy.
So we have to work out how to use computers. That comes later. Yeah, there we go. Right.
Okay, so the idea of this is to offer sort of an overview of what is really amazing about this conference, what has developed over time to make it interesting, keep people excited, make it relevant and interesting, and get people coming back every year, or get new people here every year, which is definitely happening this year and every other year. And what has happened behind the scenes to make it interesting? What has happened behind the scenes to support the conference, to make it work? And a few fun snippets, a few things that made us laugh. But it's not just look at how cool that year was and extending that. We consciously sought to sort of make it positive. We didn't want to dwell on anything that might have been negative or anything. Let's not be down on history. Let's say how awesome this conference is. So first off, though, let's just go to a few memories will pop up in the slides from various people who have organised conferences or been involved with the history of LCA. And as they appear, we'll let you read through or have a bit of a look, and we might just pause and keep some of the interesting anecdotes to appear.
So I thought we'd talk a little bit to start off with about what is CALU and Linux.conf.au, just to give some shared context or shared understanding that it's a volunteer-driven a volunteer-driven conference. It's always been run by a volunteer group, and that group actually changes every year. The focus for the conference pretty consistently has been on open source technology. I guess started off being quite Linux specific, but has gradually and appropriately migrated to include the broader open source software commons and increasingly now open hardware. We've always sought to have it be a conference that encourages learning and communication sharing of ideas and to be inspirational as far as it possibly can be. And I think it's fair to say, and I note that we've got a number of community members from around the world in the audience this afternoon, but I think it is fair to say that it is considered one of the best open source conferences in the world. It's not just a regional thing, it really does hold its own pretty well on the world stage. For my part, I guess I keep coming back because it's just something I've enjoyed. It's a bit like putting the band back together almost, where you get to reconnect with wonderful friends and colleagues from around the world, and it's always a technically inspiring way to start the calendar year.
Yeah, for me, definitely it's about friends. Originally, LCA was about the time I finished university, so my friends went overseas and got jobs in various exciting companies overseas. And then LCA was the time we would all come back and catch up. And it was just coincidentally the time we were all back here at the same time. And also since then, of people like Hugh, I've met only through this conference, although we worked briefly for a while, but originally through the conference. And I feel like I know them very well. I've known them for 20 years and seen their lives, their children's, in some cases marriages come and go, like seen significant parts of their life. That wasn't actually meant to be tied to there, but okay. And yet if you add it up, I've only actually met them for a total of a week times 20 years, 4 months, 5 months. Yeah, but spread over 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah, and like I love this conference. It's a chance to spend time learning about things that you may not have time the rest of the year doing your normal day-to-day job or doing like whatever you do, whether it's open source or various other things. We can come here and geek out and learn about lots of really interesting stuff outside our normal thing or inside, whatever. And it's really good fun seeing friends and learning good stuff.
Yeah, so just, it's easy to forget where this all started and what the world was like back then. So just to kind of set the scene, way back in the 90s, Linux was still fairly new. The traditional Unixes were fairly strong. Australia has had a fairly strong connection to early computing and early Unix, which a lot of people kind of don't know or have forgotten. I think it was like the 7th computer in the world or something was in Melbourne. John Lyons was very influential in early Unix days. He got a copy of the early Unix source code and annotated it, wrote a book alongside the whole thing, and that became an important textbook for teaching across a lot of universities around the world about how operating systems worked. And he was a lecturer at UNSW for quite a few years, which will turn up shortly. So yeah, about 98, Rusty was traveling around talking to the lugs. Again, Linux was new and kind of hard to use, and so the lugs were quite large and popular and well attended and strong bodies back then. And he was drumming up some support for an idea of having a conference. Next.
So following on from those efforts of Rusty's to pull CALU together, he ran and organised the first conference of Australian Linux users in mid-year in 1999. It was held in Monash University in Melbourne. The one keynote was from John Mad Dog Hall, and as I recall, a very inspiring discussion. It really was quite a call to arms of that early stage in our community's history. Local and international presenters, a mixture of tutorials and talks, and across quite a wide range of topics. There is actually a Wikipedia page that lists a lot, and digging into the archive.org, you can actually find a lot of that earlier material. I was chatting with Rusty yesterday, in actual fact, and he corrected me in that he had originally conceived CALU as an ongoing conference, but having sort of organised the first one, I thought, yes, perhaps that's enough for now. I'll let someone else carry it. We're also consciously not going to dig into CALU too much because it'll steal much of his thunder for later in the week. But I will note that the apocryphal story of being funded on Rusty's credit card is not so much apocryphal; it is actually true. To give a little bit more context for that era, I guess just really briefly, bear in mind that this is an era when not everyone had a laptop. Wi-Fi networking at a conference was not even a thing. Sort of, it was quite a big deal to even have Ethernet network, physical Ethernet at all. It was Slashdot almost at the height of its powers. So someone would actually print that off and bring it along each morning, so everyone could get their fix for each day of the week. But I guess a little bit of a snapshot of that early stage.
Okay. And then so post-CALU, there was a lot of excitement from people who were at CALU and from everyone we told about how amazing it was for those 3 days of geeking out. And there was also the height of the .com boom. There was a lot of excitement about Linux at the time. There was a lot of stuff going on, a lot of companies saying, Linux, Linux, Linux. And also following the following year, there was a big expo in Darling Harbour, and there was a few Linux vendors there. There was a Linux technical sort of talk stream. It was a big commercial event. CALU was not a big commercial event. They were very distinctly different. And a few of us were at all these things, and there was a feeling at the time that let's have something different again. Let's maybe have another interesting technical get-together. So there were a few things being set in motion at the time to sort of push for something to happen again.
I couldn't afford to go to that Sydney one. I actually snuck in. So 2000 Olympics in Sydney. Sydney was in the news, in everyone's consciousness around the world. UNSW, John Lyons passed away in the late 90s, and UNSW were keen to put together a Lyons memorial chair and have a conference kind of where they announced that and kind of got some excitement around that. And they approached me originally trying to see if I could help organise this Unix conference. I didn't have many contacts with the older traditional Unix world, the org community, but I did know a fair amount about Slug and Linux user groups, so I kind of turned that into a Linux conference. And yeah, so that's kind of how the first Linux.conf.au came around. We were gearing off, we want summertime, we want in-university holidays in Sydney because Sydney Olympics, and that's how we got started, bring some people in from overseas. The domain name was in a taxi ride coming back to Central Station after one of the meetings we were having, and we were brainstorming names, and someone mentioned that the Australian domain names had this little quirky .conf.au kind of special exception domain name, which was only for conferences. You could only register it for a short time, and then you'd have to abandon it again. And as soon as that got mentioned, then, oh, Linux.conf.au, perfect, done. And so that's caused a bit of a concern for Melbourne IT since, I think, but anyway.
Sorry. So I guess just to reflect on some of the challenges of organising those earlier events, the whole concept of running an open source conference, indeed a technical computing conference, is quite novel at all. So all the successive organising committees throughout those early years were pretty much starting from scratch and with relatively little references or that they could draw on from elsewhere in the calendar. The call for papers process that we now have hadn't been formalised. Linux Australia itself, indeed, was very much in its infancy and sort of formed around that same time. There weren't many people that organisers of the day could really reach out to and talk to because they really only had the previous committee or perhaps that to be able to lean on. Open source related conferences was still something of a new concept, and in some ways kind of caught in that hype cycle of being really quite commercial, and Linux is the new boom sort of thing. So there tended to be, there's things like Ottawa Linux Symposium and FOSS and a few others that were exceptions, but mostly the conferences of that era were very, very commercial in nature. The other sort of change that we see reflected in the scheduling of the conferences was a side effect of very few people at that point in time were actually paid to work on free software. I mean, a lot of people do in system administration and developer roles, but it was very unusual at that point in time to be fortunate enough to actually be paid to work on free software. So as a result, we tended to schedule the conferences to be over a weekend so that people could actually attend them at all.
So there were things that were already developing that were making this conference sort of something we wanted to hang on to. The big one is that it's a community event, it's a volunteer event, it's not a big commercial trade show event. Like, we don't have sponsors and vendors putting stuff up and trying to sell you something. This is a smaller event. It's something where we can get together and talk about interesting stuff. And another big focus is basically it's easy to attract people to the community. So we want to have hobbyists, we want to have students. So for many years, the student price was deliberately kept under $100 for a student to come. We want students to get excited about open source and Linux and come along to the conference. And so that became sort of one of the guiding things. And also keeping the technical, non-technical balance. Like, we don't want to have, all kernel track, Paul McKenney for every single session. It could be interesting to some people, but maybe not to everyone. There is a balance we have to work on, and encourage the delegates to come, encourage what happens year to year. So we'll get into that a bit later. The mini confs, that didn't start immediately, but it did come onto the conference, and it's something we've definitely held on to since. Speakers are treated well. We don't necessarily treat speakers as the only reason, they're the gods and that's it. They're not rock stars, but we do want to treat them well, so they're encouraged to come back. We like to have them here. We like to have everyone here. Then the timing, Gus already alluded to that, is put it in summer. Summer's nice in Australia. People like coming here. So, international people will come to Australia because it's a nice time to be here. And also it makes the venue easier for us because university accommodation, university dorms, we can hang out together, we can hack together. It's not some sort of formal, we go back to our hotels and disappear. And so it works out as a really good time of year to have it and attract people from overseas.
Yeah, the first mini-confs are now an important part of the conference. Originally, they were very, very unofficial, very arm's length, very separate. The first one was Debian mini-conf in 2002, and that was very just taking advantage of the fact that everyone was coming in to the conference anyway, particularly from overseas. We may as well just see if we can borrow the rooms for a few days beforehand and just have like an extended BOF. Let's just get together and talk about Debian. So the first one was quite small, just a few people, and a key signing and these important parts of Debian, building relationships within Debian. Yes. Had a trestle table and a roll of name tags. That was the infrastructure that was set up there, yes. Institutionalized early on. So that was the first one, and then the next year a few more appeared, and then after that they became more formalized and more sort of part of the conference proper. They're very useful. They're open to all the delegates. They are very useful for us as a conference because we can try out new ideas and we can try out niche topics that maybe extended BOFs. It's important enough to fill a room, but not important enough to dedicate a lot of significant space within the conference to. They also allow us to use different formats. So something like the Open Hardware mini-conf, which has become really very popular over the last few years, couldn't happen in the main conference proper because you'd have to delegate a whole room. Everyone would want to go to that for the whole day, and they wouldn't want to go to other talks that overlapped with that. And just the physical necessities of setting up soldering stations and stuff like that wouldn't translate very well to a normal conference.
So, just take a read.
We're not going to read that out aloud. We'll let you read that yourself.
It's a nice one to embarrass John a little bit, but also to show how cool the conference is. Okay, so one of the things that has happened with this conference is we do roam around the country. The first two conferences were, roam around the region, get it right. Yeah, so change of location helps in many ways. The East Coast was used a little bit early on, and then James rocked up and dragged everyone to Perth. And this was actually really good because it actually cemented the idea of different teams roaming around the region, getting different areas, showing off different areas to attendees. So, there's new people involved and there's new areas for people to come see and visit. The new teams help bring fresh ideas and fresh things to try at the conference, which is a really good thing because it doesn't get stale, they get to try stuff, they get to spend their own energy doing it, and it also allows more people to contribute to the community. If everyone was a technical sort of programmer or something, they're happy submitting patches. Not everyone in our community does that all the time or whatever. So people might come along and say, I want to help out Linux. It's something I love. How can I do that? Hey, a conference comes to your region. You can help out. It's pretty cool. Then there have been repeat city visits, but new people have been involved every time it's come back to a region or a city. And that's opened up the conference to a lot of new energy, a lot of new stuff happening.
And in that same process, so growing, I guess, the maturity of the conference has been the introduction of a formal bid process. It was by Linux Australia. It was deliberately intended to be fairly lightweight, but just to allow a way to for a team in a geography who wanted to run a conference to put together a structured document to tell us the sorts of things we know, and in fine open source style, they're shared openly once they've been finalised, and the spreadsheets and so forth that are used to put budgets together have all been released so that each successive team can sort of build off the knowledge from the previous one. Steve kind of touched on this in the previous slide, but that specifics of venue and location are something that sort of have allowed each team to mould things to suit their particular city, sort of the churches of Adelaide or the hot weather of Perth or whatever, or the winds in Wellington, as it might be. But you're able to sort of put a local flavour on each event. And that tourism aspect, I guess, has actually become quite an important thing, also not just for the attendees, but also for partners and children who often attend, as going somewhere special, being able to do scuba diving or whatever it might be that takes your fancy in a particular location. And this, I think, in terms of that sort of ability to grow the conference over the years, it's the positive experience has built up that word of mouth and that promotion that sort of has really allowed the conference to grow and expand and maintain itself over the years.
So there's expansion, and there were questions early on. Will anyone go to Perth? It's the other side of the country. It's too far away. So the team that year put a lot of energy into encouraging us all to come across to Australia. They did a video at the airport with like a person in a tux suit coming into Perth and going to the colleges, and that was pretty fascinating to us all. so there was energy there. Then when it crossed over to New Zealand, there was a lot of effort put into getting people to come to New Zealand and making a regional conference, and thus involving the New Zealand open source community, which means we get a lot more cool people to be involved with the conference. And we also had the aspect of that helped Linux Australia start dealing with running a conference in another country, and they had to work out all the sort of logistics of doing that, which took effort, but in the end, it meant we can come back more easily to New Zealand again. And the other thing is infinite growth is not a goal for this conference. We're happy with how it works, the people coming, there's enough turnover and such, but we don't want to have a 3,000 person conference or 4,000 person conference with big corporate sort of effect. It's a community event. And so complexity of organising a bigger event gets harder for a new team, and the conference atmosphere is likely to change, which we've tried slightly larger events and it's been different. You know, we do vary from year to year how it feels and how it goes, but we don't grow up to 3,000 or 4,000 people, and it's deliberate not to. And then new activities and events that any team tries get continuously evaluated. So from year to year, we can see how did those things work, how much effort was involved, do we keep doing them? And that's part of sort of rollover between the conferences.
It's fair to say that Gus wore it better than anyone ever. But,
Yep.
Under my Hawaiian shirt is.
Whoa.
The call for papers process. So originally, how the talks were selected was very ad hoc. It was just bringing in friends, people you knew, or people who knew people who would make a good speaker or talk about a good topic. This was formalized a lot more in 2005. And so now we have a separate body, the papers committee, and a process, the call for papers process, where we get submissions, analyze them. And Mary wrote a good blog post in 2006 that talks about what sort of things we look for in that process. And so if you want to submit a talk, what sort of things you should consider in order to get it accepted. And that still applies now. So that sort of shows how a fairly consistent process has been applied since that was formalized. Just for anyone who's not been involved in the behind the scenes, the mini conferences have run their own process for selecting their content. But for the main conference, we get about 4 or 5 times the number of submissions compared to the number of slots we have available, which is quite a few that we have to sift through and unfortunately discard. As the papers committee, I've been on the papers committee for the last few years, we go and we pick what the hot topics we think they're going to be for that year, or some particular speakers we think would be really good to have at the conference, and we go and we actively try to get them to submit submissions. And then once we've got all those in, at the end of the CFB close date, we review all of those. There's quite a long process with each of us looking through a bunch of them and scoring them. And yes, I've seen a few. Oh yeah, it's a month or two. Well, it's quite a lot of work. And then at the end of all of that, we come together as a face-to-face day where we kind of argue through the grey areas and the overlapping ones, and we try to pick, well, this speaker's put in 2 really good proposals, but we only want to have a proposal from one talk from one speaker. So we have to pick which one of the 2 is better, and so we do all of that negotiation. So the papers committee puts together the bulk of the conference. The conference organisers set that overall theme, which influences the sort of flavour, some of the subjective decisions we pick for topics. And they choose the keynote speakers, reflecting that as well. And then we also try to skew towards local content. So if we're here in New Zealand, we'll try to pick a few more New Zealand projects or something like that, just to try to keep a bit more local flavour in there.
So it's kind of amusing, the stories you've heard or possibly about the conference management software. There was a bit of not invented here and let's just do our own thing. Originally it was done in-house, and an older system. Then 2005, Jeremy Kerr wished to learn some new language and some new stuff, so he rewrote it from scratch. And it was used for 2 years, and then 2007, a big effort was put into have a system that would be used for a long time and lots of handover every year to the new teams, and it was developed in-house again. The whole system, and then 2017 onwards, Symposium, I'll talk about that at the end of the slide, but this is largely used for, the CFP and the hooks, but there are other issues that, it controls by parts of the conference, like the publishing, the badges, website, stuff we're all interfacing with. So we have the knowledge handover, basically the new team has to understand how to use the software, there's all the documentation, they have to use it and be comfortable with it. So Symposium has been used since 2017, and that's partly because it's not developed in-house, it's an open source system that we were able to use and adapt enough that we're happy enough with it. It's not perfect, but it is maintained by someone else and gets patches and such from outside our 2 weeks leading up to conference CFP or whatever program. So this one has an interesting point with the $300 up front too, where charities think, oh, we're not going to get much money, we don't trust that we can get that. And it was a fun event. We have, Linus getting dunked, which was quite a success. Okay, yep. Anyway, so there is a collection of experienced people that have been involved with running this conference in the past. The official term we've called them is the ghosts, or ghosts of conference past. And initially in 2004, 2005 was a mailing list, just collection of ask a question, get an answer, you can work out how to do various things. There's a lot more people involved on that list these days. And so you can reach out and get answers about how to get this conference to happen or what happens in various situations and get help. Then since around 2004, 2005, there has also been a yearly visit. Previous organising teams and people involved and such that the new conference organisers wish to have to help them put on a really good event the following year, bring them together at the new venue and get a knowledge handover, learn how to run the conference, have discussions about ideas and get more comfortable with putting on the next event because it's quite a big thing to commit to. But we, of course, do it after they've already committed, so, they can't escape. And some people have remained involved in this process over multiple years and really ensure that there is a lot of continuity between conferences, which is awesome.
Charity's been a big part of the conference from the beginning. Originally, the idea was we'd get the conference shirt and it would get signed by all the speakers who were there. I think there's one of the examples out here somewhere. And at the conference dinner, that would be auctioned off. And then the money that was raised would go to a charity. I think most people really remember the 2009 Hobart one, where the charity was a particularly identifiable, particularly important, the issue with the Tasmanian devils and the facial tumour problems they're going through. And because it was such an important charity, they switched the model from, instead of being just the winning bid is collected and goes to the charity, everyone's donations were collected and went to the charity. So it was a different model rather than an auction model. And I still remember now the guy who got on stage who given the talk about the issues with the Tasmanian devils and the big presentation about it all. Bidding opened and just money. People were throwing money. There was B-Dale was, I'll shave, if it reaches this much, I'll shave my beard off. And other, if it reaches this much, we'll let you name the next release of Linux. And all these sorts of outrageous declarations like this. And more and more money and money. And the guy on stage was just, what is happening? At the end of it, I remember he was in tears. He was on stage. I have never seen anything like that. Like, you don't understand how important this is. I can fund 2 full-time positions next year because of the last hour. So that's stuck with us for a couple of years. That model is now the one that's carried forward, and it's been very successful. I'm very proud to have been associated with some of those donations.
So the event style and flow was something we thought we'd touch on briefly, because at least for a number of you, this is your first event. But I guess the thing we wanted to try and cover at this point was that essentially what you're seeing this week is fairly typical. That's sort of that 2 days of keynotes, 2 days of mini-confs, I should say, and then 3 days of talks. There's been a constant for, I guess, probably close to the last decade now. The days and times of individual events might change. Sort of a dinner becomes a breakfast. It's realised that people don't wake up, so that that same event becomes a dinner again the following year. There's those sorts of things can and do occur. The relative informality has been a constant over the years, and there's been the odd kind of lovely exception to that where we've had, I think in Hobart, we had one of the Penguin dinner had a steampunk theme, so a lot of people went to wonderful efforts to put costumes on and do all that sort of thing. So there's all...
Auckland, yeah.
Auckland, I beg your pardon. Yeah. They're both over the water from where I live.
Yeah.
We touched on this earlier, but the change of format from being sort of weekend, a conference that sort of emphasised weekend for most of the program to accommodate people for whom the conference content was not their day job, to making it a week-long thing where most people can actually reasonably justify with their employer, or often justify with their employer to send them along. As I said, the social events have kind of varied over the years, though I am heartened to see that there's a greater emphasis these days on food than beer, and these days healthy food. So we seem to have sort of made a useful progression in that as well. We are all getting older.
So there's also been a lot of direct technical results from this. One, right from the beginning, the realisation was Australia and New Zealand, where we're geographically isolated from a lot of the rest of the world. It's very expensive, very difficult for us to travel to the big conferences over in America and Europe. So if we flip that and instead bring the speakers here, that's a lot more economically viable. So we've done a lot to build the community and the links between them, and this has led to all sorts of benefits. I know a lot of us, myself included, have had very important career moments come about directly from conversations and relationships we've built here at the conference, particularly with links with those big overseas companies and employers. There's been lots of stories of someone opening up their laptop and, oh, it crashed again. What? Oh, this never suspends properly. And the guy next to you saying, well, do you mind if I have a look? And turns out that's the person responsible for kernel suspend or something or other. And half an hour later, that person had never had access to that particular chipset, and now they have, and now it's fixed, and now it's good forever kind of thing. Lots of stories like that. You'll see every time someone's laptop doesn't do video, it's like, yeah. Keith, someone in the audience? Looping back to the earlier one, the John Lyons chair came in again a few years ago when we got a copy of the Lyons book and had it signed by all the speakers, and that was then auctioned off and raised a lot of money, and the group that bought it was a bunch of ex-UNSW alumni, and we donated it back to the university. So just to complete the circle with the earlier slide, there's now a copy of that signed by a bunch of the LCA speakers from that year somewhere in the archives of the university there. It's on display. Yeah, I think I've seen it when I walked in. Yeah.
This one does have Gus can bring this one.
2007. This I'm amusing every time. So they had a little section that was the distro couches, the distro lounge sort of area. It was just to sit on your laptop and things. And there was a collection of couches representing the different distributions. There's the Red Hat couch, which was red and kind of basically just worked. It was fairly boring, worked, functional. You could just walk up and sit down. There was a green couch for SUSE. There was the Ubuntu was fairly new at the time. There was an Ubuntu couch, and it was the burnt orange color, but very round and soft and comfortable. There was a Debian couch, which was a black seat with no back on it. It was just a flat surface. So you had to sit around and support each other. And then, of course, there's the Gentoo one, which was an IKEA flat pack. And so over the course of the conference, the Gentoo people had to assemble their own couch as they were going. So. Yeah.
Yep. And I added in the last two just because Stephen Sykes already mentioned it this week that he had a similar discussion when he first appeared at Auckland, and hey, we're here. This is awesome.
So sponsorship's been an important part of the conference from pretty early on, and I guess as a conference we've been fortunate enough to have a number of sponsors, particularly one or two, that have been very much long-term, made very much a long-term commitment to the conference, and I'll leave it to your research skills to sort of work out who they are rather than mention one or two and miss out all the rest. But this has generally been a pretty positive experience for us from a sponsorship standpoint. We've had key sponsors who have understood the nature of the conference, how to interact with it. It's fair to say we've had the odd occasion, and I'd been involved with a couple myself along the way, where we've kind of had to educate sponsors on, no, it's not really that kind of event, or no, you can't buy a keynote slot, or those sorts of things. And particularly in those early years, and it's sort of interesting to note, I think, that some of those conversations we had in the early years were with large companies which we would not consider at that point in time sponsoring the event. We just wouldn't see them as being a fit for what we do. But I think it's very, very pleasing to note that, you know, some 10, 15, 20 years on, those conferences have actually changed, so that if they did ask, we'd say yes, because they've actually become a lot genuinely open source friendly. So we've sort of outlived, we have prevailed in that kind of situation as well. We've always encouraged the local organising teams to reach out to sponsors locally, so there's always had a local flavour to the conference sponsorship as well, and that's reflected in the diversity of sponsors we have at this event, for example. And that overall process of nurturing the sponsorship relationships has been a shared Linux Australian conference organiser, so I think, which we still fine-tune a little bit more each year, but we seem to get it so closer to right as each time.
Okay, so there have been various things we've had to work around or learn to get this conference to happen every year. A big obvious one is Brisbane floods. Team that year didn't have a venue the week before their conference. And we wouldn't all have noticed, except they told us, because they did such a good job of getting a new venue. It was amazing. And so they had a lot of people step in and help to make sure that that happened. So lots of people in Brisbane, lots of people in the community stepped in and made sure that we had a conference that year. And this happens. We have a lot of people in the community and lots of people involved. This is a non-profit volunteer event, and that does help. We get a lot of assistance from people because we are just trying to get a bunch of people together to do cool stuff. Budget issues are also a bit of a thing with Linux Australia has, fortunately, since this conference has been going a while, built up a bit of money to ensure we can deliver the conference, irrelevant if there's a few problems from year to year with the budgets. But that is part of the putting on a conference. You talk to Linux Australia and make sure your budgets work out over time. Then there's also the feedback from every delegate for various parts of the conference, or the sort of balance of the technical, non-technical, or the CFP process and things like that. And we can adjust that from year to year and adjust the feedback from people to ensure that we try and keep people happy from year to year. And of course, Code of Conduct has made this a much better event. It's an ongoing process, we still work on it, but it's definitely worthwhile having, obviously. And it's good fun being here. Hugh did say we have gotten a lot healthier with our diet since. There was quite a pizza theme for early years. Canberra in 2005, we had to give away about 100 pizzas. But, you know, that's a nice example. Thank you, James.
Made out of pizza boxes, yeah.
Pizza boxes for the conference. Hmm? Yes, in the middle.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So we just put a few things up here to sort of finish off, and the mirror has all the audio from the years before video and the video from other years and some of the early program content and websites on it. So you can go and download and look at any of that. Mary's talk that Gus referenced earlier is also worth having a look at just to understand the sort of focus and trying to get a talk in and how we accept them. And then Simon has the guide that's got a lot more links to CFP and a lot of other stuff about the conference, which understanding sort of what's changed over a few years or things like that. We really would have to say thank you to all the ghosts who provided quite a lot of help with us putting this together, and to everyone who comes to the conference and organisers.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we've probably got time for a few minutes of questions, have we? The only thing I might ask the question is, because everyone in the room's probably got an LCA anecdote, but let's maybe try and angle for questions rather than, I remember when.
Yep.
Yeah.
Before I run around the room, I have a question. The Linux.conf.au domain, If I understand correctly, .conf.au was retired a few years ago,
Several
and
times
the
over,
domain
yeah.
doesn't exist anymore. Can you explain how
Okay.
you're the only domain in the world with conf.au?
Okay, you want to? Well, I know the history too.
You might as well go,
Okay,
yeah.
so basically, it was a lot of work from Steve Walsh, the admin team, and a few other people going back and forth and proving we had this grandfathered use of the domain. We were the only people who used it, but while we were using it, while it was in the early before it got retired state, you had to renew it every 6 months. And there were a few conferences where it hadn't been renewed, or Melbourne IT hadn't listened to us, or Robert Els had to go do it himself for us and things like that. Eventually, we got a bit of an agreement to have it come back for every conference, and then when it retired, we proved we had the grandfathered state and got it for perpetuity.
Several times over, where there would be like a high-level committee meeting where they would decide to shut down this domain, and the order would go down, and it would get all the way down to the bottom where the tech person who had to type, envi on the DNS entry, and it would be, wait, but hang on, what about Linux.conf.au? And it'd be a rejection would go all the way back up again.
Dave.
Are you the only 3 people that have done all 20? And if so, when's the Highlander event happen?
Have you seen how fit Steve is relative to Gus? All right.
I fondly remember all the LCA in Broome and LCA in Antarctica sort of jokes that were around.
Serious bid submissions. I'm sure LA had.
I'm still hoping for an LCA on an ocean cruise, but are there is there a venue that you think would not work?
I think an ocean cruise. I think. I mean, consider the hygiene of many of myself no better than the next, but we've.
In the ocean, yeah.
We did have one bid from outside Australia and New Zealand too. There was a fairly serious discussion about South Africa at one point for an LCA, just as an aside. Sheree.
Gentlemen, for those who are here who have not been to an LCA before, would you show the T-shirts, please?
There's a lot.
Oh, there's
In
Might be best if you
logical
come up
order,
later on.
quickly.
Yeah.
Holstering down
holstering there, holstering there. We have.
But perhaps an edited highlights. That's the CALU. CALU is the first one there. That's the first. Which these are all Steve's.
Yeah, and that's the 2001. The shirts were very cheap, so very few of them survived. But the artwork was excellent.
Yeah.
But please, by all means, come and have a look after the.
Some of the iconic ones, like the Sydney 2007 design, or the rather amusing. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it was.
Hi. I ran a little meeting in Wellington every year, which was incubated as a mini-conf in LCA, Wellington, and then in Brisbane. And what I just cannot say thank you for all the learnings. I remember Angus lecturing me in the corner, no, this is at this and this and that. And the work that you guys are doing in helping others doing other stuff just need to be recognized. So it's not just between the group of people coming here, but everyone else around. It does not get unnoticed. Thanks.
We, like I said, the only thing that we've done well is
come here every year.
Not fail to turn up. But yeah.
Not us.
It's now literally been a cast of thousands over the years, member, organisers, attendees and speakers alike. So I think everyone
Thank
deserves
everyone.
That. Yes.
Out of time. You've got 20 seconds.
Yeah.
What would you see as a big potential change to the format of LCA that you'd like to see?
Controversial question.
You've got 20 seconds.
It's pretty awesome as it is. I don't think I'd change anything.
Keeping it, yeah. There is some push to make it more basic, but we're having fun. Why change?
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.